that connects the foot of Mount Sinai all the way to the cross. It's a huge story, really, a shift from divine law to radical grace. So let's get right into it. So here's the big question that frames everything we're going to talk about. You've got this lawgiver, Moses, who leads his people right to the edge of the promised land, but can't go in himself. Then, centuries later, you have a savior, Jesus, who says he is the way. So how on earth do these two stories connect? Okay, so to unpack that, we've got to go way back to the beginning with our first guide, Moses. His entire story really sets the stage for everything that follows, starting with what we call the law. What's wild is that Moses' life splits almost perfectly into these three 40-year chunks. I mean, think about it. 40 years living as a prince in Egypt, another 40 in exile as a shepherd, and then a final 40 leading his people in the wilderness. Each part was like a different chapter of preparation. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating. The law he brought down from the mountain, it wasn't the end goal. See that Korean text on the screen? It translates to something like a tutor or a guardian. The idea here is that the law, which he got from an angel, was meant to be a spiritual tutor, something to guide God's people and teach them until something or someone else arrived. And this is such a powerful picture of his mission's limits. I mean, Moses did these incredible things. He led the people out of slavery. He built the tabernacle, which was the center of their entire world. And yet he died on a mountain, just looking at the promised land from a distance. The guide couldn't take them all the way. Okay, so if Moses and the law were the first guide, then where were they pointing? Well, that brings us to the destination and to our second key figure, Jesus. And right away, we see a huge difference. Moses received the law through an angel, kind of like a messenger giving him the spirit of a servant. But Jesus brought grace and truth directly from God the Father. This is described as the spirit of the Son. So it wasn't about replacing the law, it was about fulfilling it, completing the picture. So how did he actually do this? It boils down to these three massive steps. First, his body became the new living temple. Second, the cross was the ultimate atonement for sin. And third, the resurrection defeated death itself. And that's what opened up a totally new way to life. He didn't just point the way, he literally became the way. But you might be thinking, is this just a coincidence? Are we just connecting dots after the fact? Well, not at all. This connection was actually spelled out centuries ahead of time. Get this, it was Moses himself, the guy who started it all, who gave this prophecy. He told the people that someday in the future, God would raise up another prophet just like him. And he made it super clear, to him you shall listen. He was basically pointing to his successor. This chart just lays it all out so clearly. Let's just walk through it. Moses was born on earth. Jesus came from heaven. Moses brought the law. Jesus brought grace and truth. Moses built a physical building, the tabernacle. Jesus became the living temple. And look at the final outcome. Moses died outside the earthly promised land, while Jesus was resurrected to the heavenly one. You can see this clear pattern, this progression from the physical to the spiritual. So if you take away one thing, let it be this analogy. The law that Moses gave, think of it like a map. It's fantastic. It shows you where the destination is. It points you in the right direction. But the grace and truth from Jesus, that's the actual guide who takes you by the hand and walks you there. Okay, that's the history, the theology, but what does this actually mean for us today? How does this journey from law to grace really apply to our lives? You see, the whole point of the journey, that promised land they were trying to reach, was a preview of something bigger. The sources call it the spiritual Canaan, and that's understood to be the kingdom of heaven or eternal life. That's the real destination that both the map and the guide were pointing towards all along. So what's the path forward then? What this journey shows us is that the goal isn't about perfectly following every rule in the book. The law was the guide, the tutor. The real path to that spiritual Canaan opens up when we accept the grace that came from the cross and when we listen to the words of truth from the ultimate guide who has already made the journey for us. And that really leaves us with one final big question to think about for ourselves. When we look at our own faith, is it built more on meticulously trying to follow every turn on the map? Or is it really built on knowing and trusting the guide who promises to get us home?
Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. We are absolutely thrilled to have you joining us today
We really are. We've got a great one for you.
because we are stepping into some truly profound territory. Our mission today is to explore a fascinating theological text we have in our stack of sources.
It's an incredibly unique piece of literature, really.
Yeah, it combines a soaring poetic song with a highly detailed historical commentary. And the focus of this entire work, it is a sweeping comparative analysis of two monumental biblical figures, Moses and Jesus.
And specifically, tracing the thematic transition from the concept of law to the concept of grace and truth.
Right. And before we jump into the deep end, I do want to make a quick but crucial note to you listening right now.
Always good to set the ground rules.
Exactly. Our goal today isn't to preach to you. or to take any sides on a religious doctrine. Whether you consider yourself deeply religious, purely a history buff, or just intensely curious about ancient literature, our aim is to impartially unpack the concepts here.
Right. We're looking at the historical parallels and the imagery presented in this specific source material. Nothing more, nothing less.
We were just here to look at what the author is arguing and understand the structural ideas.
Which really is the best way to approach a document like this. It operates on several levels: historical, metaphorical, and spiritual.
Yeah.
And by examining it objectively, we can appreciate the architecture of the narrative without getting bogged down in the dogma.
Okay, let's unpack this. The text immediately sets up a stark contrast between two distinct spiritual frameworks.
The two spirits.
Right. It talks about the spirit of servanthood being associated with Moses versus the spirit of the Son being associated with Jesus. How does the commentary define these two distinct spirits right out of the gate?
Well, the author essentially uses Moses and Jesus as archetypes for two entirely different ways humanity interacts with the divine.
Okay, so Moses represents the spirit of servanthood.
Exactly. According to the commentary, his role is fundamentally earthly. He is a servant who receives and then delivers the law.
Which means his framework is built on rules. Rigid structure, strict boundaries.
Precisely. Jesus, conversely, represents the spirit of the Son. The text describes him not as an earthly servant, but as coming from heaven.
Not just to deliver another list of rules, I imagine.
No, but to embody truth and grace. So the high-level view is this macro transition, going from a servant enforcing strict requirements to a son who offers unmerited favor and internalized truth.
That sets up the philosophical divide perfectly. But what I find so compelling is how the text grounds this massive theological idea in their actual biographies.
The physical parallels are striking.
They really are. It draws these incredible parallels right from the moment these two figures entered the world. Both faced immediate, lethal threats at birth from deeply paranoid rulers.
You have Pharaoh actively ordering the death of infant boys in Moses' time.
And then, centuries later, Herod trying to eliminate Jesus.
The structural parallel there is entirely intentional by the author. In both narratives, you have the ultimate earthly authority feeling existentially threatened.
Threatened by the birth of a child who represents a new, disruptive divine authority.
Right. And both figures survive these royal death sentences through divine intervention. But the commentary draws our attention to how their methods of survival are uniquely inverted.
Yes, the Egypt connection. I was really hoping we'd get to this because the geographical inversion is such a brilliant narrative detail.
It is fascinating.
Jesus is saved when an angel warns his family to flee to Egypt to escape Herod. But Moses is saved within Egypt by Pharaoh's own daughter.
So Egypt acts as a sanctuary for Jesus.
But it's the very epicenter of captivity and danger for Moses. And yet, the royal household itself becomes Moses' hiding place.
It's a remarkable piece of narrative symmetry, and the commentary provides highly specific historical data to ground Moses' origins.
It gives dates, right?
It does. It notes he was born around 1526 BC to parents named Emram and Jochebed from the tribe of Levi.
And to save him from Pharaoh's decree, he is placed in a reed basket on the banks of the Nile River at just 3 months old.
Which is an image that has survived for millennia. Pharaoh's daughter finds this basket, realizes he is a Hebrew child, but decides to save him anyway.
And then she gives him a name. And this is where the source material dives into a linguistic breakdown that completely blew my mind.
What's fascinating here is the dual meaning of the name Moses that the author highlights. From the Hebrew perspective, Pharaoh's daughter names him Moses because it sounds like the Hebrew verb masha.
Which means to draw out.
Exactly. She literally drew him from the water. But the commentary points out that in ancient Egyptian, the root letters MS simply mean son or born.
Oh, right. Like you see that root in the names of famous pharaohs? Ramses, meaning born of Ra, or Thutmose.
Precisely. So his very name holds a dual identity. To his Hebrew heritage, he is the boy saved from the river. But in the language of his Egyptian upbringing, he is quite literally just the son.
And that upbringing is crucial to the author's argument, isn't it?
It heavily emphasizes Moses' earthly circumstantial origins. He was named by an earthly princess based on a circumstantial event.
He spends his youth as a prince, absorbing Egyptian literature, military strategy, administrative thought.
His entire foundational education is earthly, shaped by the most powerful human empire of his era.
But wait, if Moses is the one who eventually speaks to God and delivers the law, doesn't his Egyptian education kind of taint the divine purity of his mission?
That is exactly the tension the author wants you to feel. The commentary uses that earthly background to contrast Moses with Jesus.
Ah, I see.
Moses had to unlearn and repurpose his earthly education. The text explicitly points out that Jesus, on the other hand, was named directly by God.
And instead of learning the philosophy of an earthly empire, the commentary insists that Jesus, as the Son, received his teaching directly from the Father in heaven.
Right. It's the mediated earthly education of a prince versus the unmediated divine education of a son.
So if Moses starts with his elite secular education in the halls of power, how does the text handle his actual career trajectory? Because he certainly doesn't stay an Egyptian prince forever.
No, he doesn't. The commentary breaks Moses' life down into 3 distinct 40-year eras, which provides a really helpful framework.
The first 40 years, as we discussed, he is a prince in Egypt.
But that era ends in disaster.
Right. He hits 40 and has what has to be the most consequential midlife crisis in history. He tries to take matters into his own hands, tries to save an enslaved Israelite, ends up killing an Egyptian, and has to flee for his life.
He goes from the absolute center of global power to a complete, desolate exile. The text notes he spends his second 40-year chapter as a traveler or a stranger in the wilderness of Midian.
Think about that culture shock. He goes from palace courts to herding sheep in a desert for 4 decades.
The author views this as a period of extreme isolation and breaking down of his ego.
A completely different kind of education, stripping away the Egyptian prince to build a desert survivor.
And then, at 80 years old, comes the command to return.
He walks back into Egypt, which leads to the 10 plagues, the judgment of Pharaoh, and the Exodus. But once he gets the Israelites out into the desert, the text zeroes in on the actual mechanics of how Moses gets the law.
Yes.
And there's a detail here that seems really strange. The text says, Moses received the law on Mount Sinai from an angel, a messenger of the Lord.
Right.
Why does the author make such a big deal out of the fact that an angel handed it to him rather than God directly?
Because in ancient theological frameworks, mediation matters. The author is emphasizing distance. The chain of communication goes from God to an angel to Moses and then finally down to the people.
It's heavily mediated.
Exactly. It implies a separation between the divine and humanity. Contrastingly, the text argues that Jesus bypassed all of that. Coming from heaven, he received truth directly from the Father. No angels, no middlemen.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the author doesn't just say the mediated law is bad and direct truth is good. The commentary introduces a specific concept for the law. It calls the law a tutor or a guide.
The term used in the original language's philosophical background essentially means a strict disciplinarian. It is vital to understand that this kind of tutor in the ancient world was not a friendly teacher who helps you with your homework.
It's not someone bringing flashcards and snacks.
Not at all. It was typically a strict servant whose sole job was to keep a child disciplined, keep them out of trouble, literally walk them through dangerous streets to get to the actual schoolmaster.
They carried sticks, didn't they?
Yes, they were disciplinarians. The text argues that the law was that kind of tutor. It was a temporary, uncompromising framework meant to enforce basic boundaries, keep humanity from destroying itself, and prepare people for the arrival of Jesus.
That paints a completely different picture. It's like a terrifying principal who just keeps you in line so you survive to graduation.
Exactly.
The law provides the discipline, but it doesn't provide the ultimate freedom or grace. But wait, if the law was given by God, why would the text reduce it to just a temporary chaperone? Doesn't that diminish everything Moses suffered for?
It doesn't diminish it, it contextualizes it. The commentary argues that you cannot understand the freedom of grace until you understand the strict requirements of justice.
The law was a diagnostic tool.
Exactly. It showed humanity its flaws. But a diagnostic tool can't cure the disease. That's why it was temporary. And the text brilliantly illustrates this limitation of the law through a profound tragedy in Moses' own life.
You mean the fact that he never made it to the finish line?
Precisely. Despite leading the people for 40 years in his final era, Moses never actually reached the promised land.
Let's talk about that, because the text references the waters of Meribah in the wilderness of Sin. For those listening who aren't familiar with the nitty-gritty of the Exodus story, what exactly did Moses do at Meribah that was so egregious?
The commentary highlights both the physical action and the psychological breaking point.
The Israelites are in the desert, they have no water, and they are relentlessly complaining again.
And God instructs Moses to take his staff and simply speak to a rock and water will flow. But Moses, who is over 100 years old at this point and deeply frustrated, disobeys the specific instruction.
Instead of speaking to the rock, he yells at the people. He says, "Must we bring water out of this rock for you?" And strikes the rock twice with his staff.
He loses his temper.
Yeah, I mean, after 40 years of dealing with 1 million complaining people in a desert, hitting a rock feels like a pretty mild reaction. Why is the consequence so severe?
Because of what the action represents. The text explains that Moses failed to demonstrate God's holiness. He acted out of rashness and unbelief.
By saying, "Must we bring water?" he inserted himself into the miracle.
He stole the divine glory. And more importantly, he misrepresented God's character. God wasn't angry with the people in that moment. God just wanted to provide water. But Moses lashed out in rage.
So because he operated out of human frustration rather than reflecting divine holiness, the consequence was that the bringer of the law would be judged strictly by the law.
Right. And as a result, he only gets to look at Canaan from Mount Nebo and Mount Pisgah before dying, right there in the land of Moab.
It is a wildly tragic end to his personal story.
It is deeply poignant, but the commentary synthesizes this information and elevates it into a brilliant historical and theological metaphor. Moses led the people for 40 years, but he had to hand the reins over to his successor, Joshua.
Joshua is the one who actually crosses into Canaan.
Exactly. The author points out that just as Moses had to hand over the reins to Joshua to conquer the land, the law leads people through the spiritual wilderness, but must hand over to Jesus' grace and truth to enter the spiritual Canaan.
Which the text defines as heaven. The law gets you to the border, but only grace can carry you across the river.
That's the core argument.
And what's fascinating is that the source material points out Moses actually knew he wasn't the final answer. He knew he was just the tutor.
Yes, he did.
The text quotes a direct prophecy from Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 18. He tells the Israelites, "The Lord will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your brothers. To him you shall listen."
That ultimate prophecy is the linchpin of the commentary's argument. Moses, the ultimate earthly servant, is actively pointing his people away from himself and toward the future,
He is explicitly stating that someone greater is coming.
and that their ultimate obedience shouldn't remain with the old framework, but with that future prophet.
Which naturally brings us to the final major theme we need to tackle today, the structures these two figures are associated with. The poetic song we mentioned in the intro spends a lot of time contrasting the physical tabernacle built by Moses with the metaphorical temple associated with Jesus.
To understand the poetry, we have to understand the physical reality of what Moses built. The tabernacle wasn't just a simple tent in the wilderness.
Right.
It was a massive, intricate, highly regulated, portable structure. It had layers of separation, outer courtyards, inner rooms, and the Holy of Holies.
It required immense physical labor to move, and it was constructed of earthly materials, wood, metals, animal skins.
And it was heavily restricted. It was the architectural embodiment of the law. It visually demonstrated separation and boundaries. But the text explains that the final completion didn't come in the form of a better physical building.
Jesus became the temple. He became the head of the church.
Yes, the text asserts that Jesus completed the salvation journey by dying on the cross, resurrecting, and sitting at the right hand of the Father's throne.
Let's pause on that because the text frames this transition as atonement. For a listener who might not be steeped in religious doctrine, how does the text conceptualize this?
Conceptually, it's about repairing a fundamental breach. If the law is a scale that humanity constantly tips out of balance through failure, atonement is the ultimate balancing of those scales.
So Jesus' sacrifice essentially paid the debt demanded by the strict rules of the law.
Exactly. And by balancing the scales permanently, the physical building with all its restricted access is rendered obsolete. The separation is removed.
If we look at the poetic song from the sources, there's a lyric that captures this perfectly. It says, "I will no longer be bound by the law. I am embraced by the grace of the cross."
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that lyric is the core message the text wants you to walk away with. Believers are urged not to be bound by the constraints of the law, but to receive the grace of Jesus' atonement.
The physical journey of the Israelites is a mirror for the spiritual journey of the believer, moving from bondage through discipline into lasting peace.
And that's it, exactly.
So what does this all mean for you listening right now? If you come from a faith background, this text is obviously a foundational roadmap.
Of course.
But even if you aren't religious, there is profound value in understanding how historical and theological texts frame human progress. It is the story of moving from strict, rigid rules, that disciplinarian tutor, into a state of internalized understanding, grace, and truth.
It's a remarkably sophisticated way to view maturation, outgrowing the need for external boundaries because you've internalized the deeper concepts.
And the way the commentary uses the tragedy of Moses to illustrate that maturation is just brilliant.
This raises an important question when you start thinking about the nature of leadership and legacy.
I love a good takeaway. What's the final thought?
The text suggests that the greatest leaders, like Moses, are often the ones who build the foundation for a destination they will never get to enter themselves. Moses did the grueling work of being the guide, knowing he was laying the groundwork for someone else to cross the river.
Wow.
So the provocative thought I would leave you with is this. Where in your own life are you acting as the tutor? Where are you laying the groundwork for a future you might not see, but that is essential for the next generation's promised land?
Are you building a destination you won't get to enter? That is a profound thought to chew on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We unpacked a mountain of ancient history and complex theology today, and we hope you found it as compelling as we did. Keep exploring